Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 117, and today we're going to be talking about why top players win more and how can you join that illustrious group. And we're going to use, of course, the 17 lens data for Outlaws of Target Junction. Before we go into that, I would like to thank my sponsor, mtgazone.com. I just released a new article there today talking about the early data. It is slightly linked to the last week's seminar, but I actually took the data from yesterday, so it has slightly different information because some cards win rates changed, and it expands on some themes. So I'll try to put it in the description, give it a read. Also, thanks to my patrons who are supporting me. I didn't have any new patrons this week, at least not new paid patrons, but Kyle joined as a free member. And if you don't want to pay anything, joining as a free member to the Patreon is also a good idea. You know, you get my updates of what's going on. So you get some kind of notifications, which might be useful. And, you know, one day maybe you will decide to become a paid patron. And you get some perks, including access to those slides soon to be available for the patrons. Also, thanks to Bulkbox, who have given me opportunity to get my own personal discount code. So if you're in UK, say St. Ives, and you're looking for a good box for bulkbox.com/store, and you can use ShareCode10 as a code, and I get a 10% discount on the boxes. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start with the preamble. And today it's based on, I really tried to somehow introduce my braggy deck into the podcast, and I didn't have a good idea how to do it, but in the end I came up with it. I got some comments that my deck had atrocious mana base, and you shouldn't build something like that ever and be rewarded with a trophy. I did trophy with it. And this led me to the thought that there is maybe some slight misconceptions about splashing. And there is a big difference between splashing a third color and splashing 5 colors at the same time. It's two very different animals. And here I can brag about my deck. So this is it. Of course, it's a Gruul deck, but a Gruul deck with a bit of splashing, including Bonnie Paul, Rakdos, Fractured Identity, Any Joins Up, which requires white. And that's basically it. That's it in terms of splashing. Oh, sorry, there's Eartha Joe still. Rest of the cards are just green and white. I got Bristly Bill, I got Colossal Ratterworm, I got a Hellspur Posse Boss. It was filled with bombs to the brim. But obviously people start looking at it and said, oh, wow, you're playing Gruul and you are splashing Rakdos, which has double black in its cost, and Bonipal, which has double blue in its cost, and Fracture Identity, which is basically a blue-white card. And how do you manage to achieve it? Only having 2 pylons from lands, 1 Inspiring Vantage, and 1 Lonely Arroyo. And the rest are basics. I have 1 swamp, 1 island, 1 plains, 4 mountains, and 6 forests. And well, the trick for this deck is that I only literally need 2 sources of different colored mana to cast either Bonipol or Rakdos or Fracture Identity. And this was my target. I don't need to splash 3 black cards, which would require me to have like consistent sources of black mana. The cards I splashed, it is important to also note, these are game-ending cards. I play Bonipol, I'm going to win most of the games I cast it. I cast Rakdos, I'm going to win most of the games I cast it. I cast Fracture Identity, I'm going to win most of the games I cast it. So these are not just like any random cards I'm putting in this deck. I'm putting game enders. And because these are game-ending cards, I can make some sacrifices in order to enable myself to cast them. And this deck had a weird way of doing it. I have 2 Oasis Gardeners. This was a very important part of my deck because Oasis Gardener, I don't care if I have Rakdos in my hand or Bonipol, it gives me 1 of the mana that I need. If I put in, say, green-blue Desert, that would still make me only closer to casting Bonipol, and I would have still big problems with casting Rakdos. If I splashed only Bonipol, that would be a fine idea to splash this Lush Oasis, but if I splash both Rakdos and Bonipal and Fractured Identity, I'd rather have the Oasis Gardener. And normally I don't like this card. I think in this deck it was particularly good. What else is hiding in this deck is 2 Gold Pans. And again, this is not a card I'm super happy playing, although I do like it in Gruul decks because there's plenty of good 3-power creatures in Gruul decks, and there's also plenty of 4-power synergies. So if you play a good 3-power creature and you put Goldpan on it, it becomes a 4-power and therefore wakes up all your synergies that you might be needing. So you can get Trample from the Cactus Sure Shot. You can draw some cards from something. You can get a treasure when you attack with that creature with Jolene. And one important card that I do like playing in my Gruul decks is Bristlepack Sentry. Having a Goldpan is something that will allow me to attack with it even if I don't have anything else on board. And very frequently people will try to kill the 4-power creatures and you're left with that Sentry that cannot attack. This stops that from happening. I also had Gold Rush, another way of splashing in my deck. And I also had Jolene, Plundering Pugilist, which is able quite efficiently to create a treasure token in this deck. And honestly, I had never problems in casting any of my Atrocious Bomb, even though my mana, when you look at the lands, only looks pretty questionable. But it's not in the lands that my splashing capacity is hiding. And someone did the maths because I didn't reply to the comment that was telling me that I'm lucky that I was able to trophy with this deck. They calculated I had roughly 9 blue sources and 8 black sources in this deck, despite not having having a single swamp that can give me black mana. So you can make very extravagant choices in your deck if you make sure that some of the deck is dedicated to splashing. And a card like Gold Rush may not be great, but I did win one game by casting it because I had a treasure lying around and I attacked with something. An opponent was racing me and they decided to let the attack in. I just cast the Gold Rush for lethal. So it's not completely useless. Goldpan, I did, in fact, put it on Bristlepack Sentry in one of the games just to get more value. Also, Free Strider Lookout was a good way of looking through lands if I managed to get something. Like, I had a game when I was just like attacking with the 4-power creature, getting a treasure from Jolene, pinging something, and activating Free Strider Lookout to find the lands that I needed. Also, Colossal Rattleworm, if it doesn't die, I win. If it dies, I can find myself the pylons that I need for my extra mana. Like lots of those small synergies that allowed me to cast things quite efficiently. So as you can see, splashing for 5 colors is very different, and I wouldn't have made that kind of a mana base if I was only splashing one of the cards. I would probably try to make sure that I have lands that can give me the color. By the way, Annie Joins Up is a fantastic build around, and if you ever are in a situation that you're drafting like white-green or white-red, maybe you have Eartha Joe already, and you see Annie Joins Up, it's worth to pick it and just try to figure out how can you squeeze the most synergies out of it. Because I can tell you, with Eartha Joe and the mercenary tokens activating 3 times for each tap, it becomes very much fun. Not to mention Jolene pinking for 2 instead of pinking for 1, and a bunch of those little synergies. Like, of course, I was drawing 2 cards from Bonipal, and that's busted already. Okay, but let's go to the main topic before we go into the specifics of top players and not top players. Let's look at the metagame evolution. I took the data from week 1 and week 2. Slightly dodgy definition because we are not yet in full 2 weeks, but I took first 5 days of the format and then the second 5 days of the format to look at how did the popularity of the decks and the win rate of the decks change over time. One thing we can see is that Golgari and Selesnya became way more popular in week 2 compared to week 1. Selesnya was already very popular. It's going to be not only on Twitch but also on YouTube. It was already 22% of all the decks. You would expect in a perfectly balanced format to have 10% of each color pair, but Selesnya was already drafted at 22% in the first 5 days. Now it's 26% almost. So there was still an increase, and it's still winning quite a lot, as we will see in a second. So the market is still not saturated. This doesn't mean that the totality of Arena is drafting it at 26%, because, well, we have only data from maybe 5% of the players from 17 lands. There is just, not enough people subscribing to 17 lands. By the way, if you're not using it, I would highly recommend that you do, because it's very useful for yourself. So it is the 17 lens users that opportunistically draft more Selesnya. Unfortunately, we don't know how does it look like in terms of general population. I'm pretty sure that still more people draft Selesnya than on average it should be. But yeah, this number is strictly for 17 lens users. These are the most invested players. They know what's going on, and they will be forcing the busted deck in the first days when it's still quite open. Golgari also had seen an increase. It was the second most drafted deck in the first 5 days. 14.5% of the population drafted it, of the 17 lands population. And now it's 18%, so 3.5 percentage points increase. There have been other colors that became less popular. And the biggest drop was for Izzet. Izzet was almost 9% in the first 5 days, and it dropped to 5.8, so roughly 6%. Also, Rakdos dropped from 10.7 to 9.1, still got a quite high level. Gruul dropped from 10 to 9, roughly. And Azorius lost a percentage point. It was at 6, now it's at 5. Boros the same. It was at 6, now it's at 5. Simic dropped from 7.1 to 6.4. So slight drops all across the board. Only deck that gained, apart from the two most popular ones, is Orzhov. And Orzhov is, I think, a color combination you should be looking into if you want to get something that is relatively open and quite powerful at the same time, because it has good numbers. And we come to those good numbers. We're looking at the win rates of those decks for the first 5 days and later. So the top deck of the first week was, unsurprisingly, Selesnya with 59. This has since dropped to 58, which is still the number one, and not really threatened by anyone. Golgari was second one in the first 5 days at 58%, but it dropped to 55.8. And I'm precise here. Normally I round them up or something. I'm precise here because Orzhov, which was at 56.6, dropped to only 56, which means that by 0.2 percentage points, it is actually now the second highest win rate deck in the last 5 days. And still very much underdrafted. We saw that only 6% of people, 7% of people draft Orzhov. So it looks like it's undervalued and yet quite powerful. I would, send you to my article. I describe what makes Orzhov tick in this article, and hopefully, at least what data suggests makes it tick. And based on that, maybe you can make a good opinion about how you want to draft Orzhov. And most of the decks did have some drops in the first days. This is normal. The article is on mtgazone.com. When I release it as a YouTube video tomorrow, I'll put the link in the description, but also on my Twitter you can find. I linked it today. So 7,000 words about every single archetype in the format. It took me 3 days to write it, and I was not pleased about the state of my fingers after that. I also have to write for normal work, so it's just like I'm a type monkey basically. Gruul dropped by 1 percentage point from 56 to 55.2, and now is the fourth deck. I mean, it was the fourth deck, now it's still the fourth deck. Boros did increase a bit, and this deck is also slightly underdrafted, so maybe it's worth checking out what's going on in there. It was at 54.5, now it's at 54.8. I think it's a deck that is, you can draft it without feeling ashamed of yourself and get some good results. Dimir increased from 52.9 to 53.4. But Dimir is a very particular one. I think it's a deck that has a huge disproportion between how much do top players win with it and how much do lower win rate tier player win with it. In top tier, as you will see, it is actually one of the best decks in the format. And I think that if you learn how to draft Dimir correctly, you can get really, really good results with it. I mean, on par with things like Golgari, Orzhov, and who knows, maybe even threatening Selesnya once the format crystallizes and people start drafting green much heavier. And then we have the decks that are the color combinations that are, well, Simic is still doing all right at 54. But then we have Rakdos that is now at 52.6, dropped by 0.4 percentage points from week one. Azorius roughly stayed the same at 51.5. And Izzet was at 50% already in first week. but it dropped further back to 49.3. Squirrel Martini has a good question. Only 2 going up and 8 going down. Where does this average out? Players with lower win rate, players playing more colors and winning? No, this is only the data from 17 lens users. So what does it mean? If 17 lens users play or win less, it means that the non-17 lens users win a bit more. So usually the first couple of days, 17 lens players have an advantage because they did their maths, they looked at the early data, they know more, so they win more. But over time, people start listening to LR, listen to Corticals, listen to who knows, maybe even me, but probably if they listen to me, they use 17 lens though. And they get the idea of what's going on. They see deck lists, pictures on whatever internet source they are using. Maybe they're in some Discords, and they get the sort of information, and it catches up very quickly. But yeah, this is a very good question where it happens. As you can see, the average is not even close to 50%. The average here is around 55%. It's around 55%. So clearly, you know that there must be something weird with this data, because if it was data from all the arena users, which I would love to have my hands on, then you would have, of course, the 50% win rate. Actually, I think that we are losing quite a lot of information, because you would want maybe more beginner players to be represented more in the data to know how to effectively reach them. This is going to be partially partially we're going to talk about this today, about how should you know if you are in a top tier, in the mid tier, or in the bottom tier, and what to do to move up, because that's what we want to do. We want to improve how we play Magic. Now, the same thing for the top players only. Top players on 17 lands is a group that consistently do well across multiple formats. So they had to be in the top bracket for at least 2 of the last 3 formats. Their average win rate is usually around 60%, so quite high. Yeah, these are the most invested players. These are the ones that live limited. And when you look at them, you see the same trends as we've seen in the all-player group. Selesnya is the most played. It was 25% in the week one, so 3 percentage points higher than in the general population. They were already higher on Selesnya than the average player would be. Now they are 28, which is even more. Golgari, they were also higher on Golgari in the week one, 18%, but now it's 22.7. And also Orzhov grew from 5.3 to 8.4. So these players clearly do understand that Orzhov is something that is behaving quite well. Also, they were lower on those archetypes that did worse in the first days. So Izzet, they were only at 7%, and it dropped down to 4.6. Oh yeah, that's not a win rate. That's a frequency of playing. I knew that I'm going to miss one of the axes, but at least someone is reading them, unlike me. This is what percentage of the decks are being played. Yeah, so you'd expect 10% average. 28% win rate would not be amazing. But you can see that lots of those decks, Gruul drops by almost 4 percentage points. Izzet by 3, Rakdos by 2-ish. Simic drops also by 2% or by 1.5% roughly. And, Azorius and Boros dropped to like almost non-existent levels, like 3.6 and 3.8% of the decks in week 2 were Azorius and Boros. That's only looking at the 2-color decks. I'm not taking a look at the 3-color decks, but it does include 2-color decks with splashes. Also, we're going to see that in the next slide. These are the win rates. So this is where we see how much they are winning. What you can see is that, first of all, Golgari saw quite a large drop in win rate. It was 60.8% in the first 5 days. Now it is around 59.2. And Selesnya also dropped a little less. It was 61.3. Now it's 60.8. These are high numbers, but this is from top players, because top players win a lot. They are going to have high win rates. And of course, part of the fact that they have the high win rate is because more than a quarter of the decks that they play is Selesnya. So it will have a very big impact on the average win rate, because almost no one plays Azorius or Boros, and almost no one plays Izzet. However, if you look at Boros and Izzet specifically, and Dimir, these three decks have seen quite big increases in the win rate. Boros grew from 56 to 58, Izzet grew from 53 to 56, and Dimir grew from 58 to 60.1. And 60.1, that's higher than Golgari, actually. It's just about the level of Boros, which is Orzhov, which is now at 60.4, and not far from Selesnya. So actually, when you look at the top players, Dimir is the third most winning color combination. And I did a small Twitter thread today on the fact that it's super weird that when you look at general population, Dimir and Rakdos have very similar win rate, around 53%. But when you look at the top commons from Dimir, if you look at top 10 of them, they each have like 3 percentage point higher win rate than top 10 commons of Rakdos. And it's strange, because how can it be that decks that are so close to each other in terms of generic win rate are so far apart in terms of the win rate of their commons? And my conclusion was that Dimir's problem in terms of win rate is that lower tier players, the ones with lower win rate in general, are doing really, really bad with Dimir. And they are losing a lot of games. But they are also putting the wrong cards in Dimir decks. While the top players, who are having a very, very high win rate with Dimir, are putting the right cards. Therefore, the win rate of those top cards is going to be elevated because they are played disproportionately more by really good players, and the win rates of the cards that are bad is going to be even extraordinarily lowered by the fact that they are being played by players who don't understand how this archetype works. And the other conclusion from that was that Dimir is literally Desert Dew deck. You want to have as many Desert Dews as you can physically get, and you want to have as many Desert as you physically can get, and that's how you should be playing this deck. And then when your 2-mana spell can become basically a catch-all removal, that's when the deck becomes very successful. Mirror Broker. You can go to 17lands.com and you can look at the card statistics, and you can check the mirror, and you can select only for commons, and you can sort them by the win rate, and in 5 seconds you will see literally what are those 10 commons. Or you can go to the article that I wrote on MTGA Zone and at least see some of the top cards in that archetype. Okay. Other decks that increased, Rakdos also increased from 56 to 57, so that's a small bump in it. And things like Gruul dropped by roughly a percentage point. Orzhov, as I mentioned, stayed more or less at the same level. Simic dropped by a little. And Orzhov is the second best win rate deck. And, the difference between 60.1, 60.4, and 60.8 is not that big. So despite the maybe narrative that Selesnya is the best deck by far, and you have to play green to be successful, top players seem to buck this trend. And actually, Orzhov and Dimir are in top 3, statistically not different from Selesnya's win rate. So think about it for a second when you're trying to introspect what this format is all about. Okay, so we can start looking at the specific data of this bottom tier, middle tier, and top tier. I'm going to start with a very simple one. Are there differences in how those groups of players are playing the format? So red, we have the bottom tier players, the ones with the roughly 50% win rate. Blue is the middle group with around 55% win rate. And gray is top tier. In this particular set, it's around 59% win rate that those players have. And I looked at how many colors they play in the deck, because I want to see some of those meta trends. And one thing that is quite typical is that the top players tend to splash a bit more. So when you look at the 2-color decks played, the bottom and the mid tier play around 40% of their decks are strict 2 colors without any splashing. But for the top tier, it's only 37% of the decks. And when you look at 2 colors decks with the splash, which is defined in 17 lands as between 1 and 3 cards of a different color plus some mana sources that enable to cast those spells, 38% for the bottom tier, around 41% for the middle tier, and around 45% for the top tier. So there is a sort of like, the better the player, the more they are sort of splashing. But only splashing. They don't go full 3 colors, which means they don't put more than 3 spells from the third color. When you go to that point, 15% of the decks of the lower tier players are strictly 3 colors, but only around 10% of the top tier's decks. So a good 50% drop between the bottom tier and the top tier. And if you go even further, like 3 colors and a splash, so like let's count them properly 5 color decks, you will see that the top players play slightly more of that actually. So 3 color is the spot where it's probably the most dangerous spot to be, because it's really hard to draft 3 color decks with the fixing that this set has to offer. It's much easier to draft actually 4 or 5 color decks like the one that you saw in my preamble than to draft a strictly 3 color deck. 3 color decks would require some dedication. But splashing into a 2 color deck is absolutely trivial. So you can do it, and if power gives you some incentives to do it, by all means do, because there is not much penalty in terms of win rate for splashing in this format. Okay, this graph is a bit annoying, and I do know it, but I think it's also quite important. So here I looked at the deviation from average win rate by player tier. Problem with comparing win rates between group of player with a particular average win rate and a group of players with a very different win rate is that if I show them on one graph, well, they will all be higher in one case, because top players win more with every archetype. So you don't see that much of what's going on in there. So instead of that, I look at the deviation from average. So the 0 line is the average win rate for each of the groups. I have 2 groups. One of them is the top players, and the other group is the non-top players. So everyone else that's not in this top tier of 17 lands data. And if I look at Selesnya, the non-top tier players win around 3 percentage points more with Selesnya decks than their average win rate. So this is the boost that they get for playing Selesnya. Top players only 1.6 percentage points. So they don't get that much of a boost for playing Selesnya, because Selesnya in part is a deck that doesn't let you squeeze out much more from the cards than what it says on the cards. They are rather straightforward to play. They're powerful, so they're going to win a lot. But top players gain their edges on slight synergies, making more choices, making good decisions, basically getting as much from cards that as they can. And I don't know if you know Hum TV, but Hum TV once said something that stuck with me, is that, look, if I pick this 4/4 trampling creature for 4 mana, I know it's decent, but it's going to be decent for me and for the random person playing a draft. But this spell that gives me like a modality and choice and some options for card draw and whatever, this card is going to benefit me way more than it's going to benefit a random person from Arena, because I know how to play it. I know what decisions to make. And it's true that top players will often choose strategies that give them more choice, more flexibility, cards that are situational, because they know exactly when they are in the situation when they can choose one mode or the other. And because of that, those cards become multitasking tools that they can use accordingly to the situation. While maybe when you're a beginning player, you don't make those choices optimally, and it actually be detrimental to your win rate to play some certain cards that offer too much choice. And I've seen that since I started looking at the top players' data, I saw that, for example, in Dominaria United, the card that had the biggest delta in win rate between the bottom tier and the top tier was actually Impulse. Because Impulse, you look at 4 cards and you need to select the one that is going to push you forward in the best fashion. And well, 17 lens users, the top 17 lens users, knew exactly which card to pick from an Impulse. And because of that, it was super beneficial for their win rate. While when you're a beginner, you will frequently make bad choice. that's not for me to say that you shouldn't be playing those cards. It's just that you should be aware of the impact they might have on your game. And actually, when you look, cards that are simpler and maybe like one way of using them behave better in the hands of the beginner players, because they know exactly what they should be doing. It says on the tin what they are doing, and decision making process does not allow for many mistakes. So this is some kind of, that's why I think it's important for you to self-diagnose at which level of development you are. And next part of this seminar is going to be dedicated to trying to find the sort of indicator cards, the cards that playing with them well or not well is a stark difference between certain tiers of players that hopefully will allow you to position yourself in which tier you are. With that digression out of the way, we can look at the rest of the graph. First thing that I see when I look at this graph is that the top players' delta around the average is not that big. Selesnya is the most outside of the average with 1.6 percentage point difference. And Azorius is the lowest win rate archetype in this top player group at 2.9. So everything is within 4.5 percentage points from each other. Not that much. Pick the best archetype, you win slightly more. Pick the worst archetype, you win slightly less. The difference is not a chasm. The range between the best archetype for the non-top players, Selesnya, and the worst, is almost 10 percentage points. So that's a big difference between choosing Selesnya and choosing Izzet as the color that you're going to draft. This shows you that maybe if you think that you might be in this bottom to middle tier of drafters, maybe you should be much more assertive about avoiding drafting Izzet. And maybe you should be looking more into Selesnya, Orzhov, or Golgari, Gruul, those archetypes, because they seem to have, a beneficial win rate for you. Faders has a question. It's not a weird question. It's a question. How do I know if I'm in the top players section or not? You don't. I even don't know if I am. I assume that I am. But as a rule of thumb, if you had around 60% win rate in the last 3 sets, maybe 59 or something, you probably are. If you are around 55, you're probably in the middle tier. And if your win rate for the last 3 sets was around 50%, you're probably in the bottom tier. And this, of course, is the data for best of 1. Those numbers will be different for best of 3, but I just don't do enough best of 3 analysis to actually know the answer to what numbers are. But probably, like plus 5 percentage points for each of the tiers in best of 3. So important things that I can see here. First of all, Gruul is a positive archetype for those non-top players. They have a win rate that is above their average win rate when they play Gruul. But for the top players, Gruul is not. And this goes back to the same thing I was telling you about, is that when you draft the giant beaver, it's going to be okay with a beginner player or a lower win rate player, because the card just does things. It's a 4/4. If it's unopposed, it will win the game. But it doesn't do much more than it says on the tin for the top players, and therefore it sort of lowers their win rate. Thunderwunk, yeah, the top players are hitting 75, 80%, but we're talking about a larger group. It's going to be around 65 probably. Top player in best of 1 is around 67, 60, 68%. But the average for the top players on 17 lands is around probably 59 for this set. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, Jorbul's Sam Black 68% is in best of 1, not in best of 3. Okay. Another archetype that is interesting is Dimir that we talked about. It is 2 percentage points below average for the non-top players, but it's a whole 1% above the average win rate for the top players. So clearly they figured it out, and I would really send you to either my article or 17 Lands Data if you're interested about it. But there are some non-obvious cards that you should be playing in the mirror. And I think that this color combination is really good. It's probably just needs some figuring out. And then, as I said, is particular that only 2.7% below average for top players, which is still not great, but it's better than 6 percentage points below average for the non-top players. So this is another archetype when some figuring out how to run it will be beneficial for your win rate. Yeah, Sam Black had a great episode on the Grixis colors, so you can get some hints of what to be doing there from Sam. I listened to it, obviously, because I listened to every episode of Sam. And it was fun. And it was very, very smart and opened my eyes to certain things that you should be doing in Grixis, yeah. And Boros is another one. It has a slightly better win rate than average for the non-top players and 1 percentage points below average for the top players. But this is a smaller difference than 3 percentage points spread for Demir, for example, which is quite a large difference when you think about it. Important is that Golgari is one of the top drafted color combinations, but I think that the Golgari in the first week was benefiting from green being way too open. And now that the green is not as open as it used to be, Golgari is more or less about average as an archetype. I'm not going to comment on that, Fundervunk. This is the most Sam Black thing to happen. Resolving Cruel Ultimatum 3 times in the same game today. Yep, just loop them. The testament to Sam's playstyle is that after doing it twice, he still didn't win. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at cards that are valued highly by top players, and probably I should have put it earlier, but we're looking at the top, mid, and bottom 17lens.com tiers. Bottom tier 48.2% win rate, middle tier 55.2% win rate average, and top tier 58.6% win rate. What cards are picked more aggressively and why? And for that, I looked at the metric in 17lens data called average taken at, and it tells you where the card was taken. We see cards roughly on average in a particular spot. So, you know that a bomb will not go far. You may see it only when you open it, or maybe it's going to be passed to you because someone opened a better bomb because it's play boosters. But you will not see it pick 7. So we know that it's going to be picked around pick 1, 2, 3. Like an average common is going to be picked around 6 picks. So it's going to be, you're going to be picking it 5th, 6th, maybe 7th. But when you look at the different tiers of players, some cards are going to be picked a bit earlier by the top players, and some cards are going to be not picked by them that aggressively. So they're going to just ignore picking them. And when do they pick the cards might be, and where the differences between those things are, maybe like a good hint for you at which cards are particularly valued by the top players, and also which cards are particularly overlooked by the lower tier players. And if you think that you're in one of the lower tiers, then maybe you should, draw some attention to those cards, because maybe you're also ignoring them, and then top players, they do pick them. But also when you do that, remember that some cards, you need to sort of accrue a certain amount of abilities in order to be able to play them efficiently. So know which cards top players do play, but also measure your gameplay skills and think if you can actually play those cards as efficiently as you can, or are you still learning? I'm not saying you shouldn't be playing them, but you should be knowing that by playing them, you might be, in the short term, lowering your win rate. In the long term, you're going to learn, and this is what you should be doing. But you have to be aware of the fact that learning how to play more complex strategies is going to be a painful lesson, and it's going to be sometimes miserable. I have a question. If two 17lens users are 1 seat apart in the draft, will 17lens get the data of the picks for the player between them? You can, but you need to bloody extract it. And I tried to do it a couple of times, and it's a pain. But yeah, you can. First, I'm going to look at the cards that are picked very highly by the top players. Or not very highly, but higher than by the other groups. This is the metric of how many picks higher are they picked by the top players than by the bottom players in this particular case. So if you look at the Getaway Glamour, the number 1 card, and this is the spree card that can exile something and blink it, or it can destroy target creature if no other creature has greater power. This card is picked a full half pick earlier by the top player versus the bottom player, so they clearly value the card. And well, let's see if we can find some kind of a pattern in the cards that we see here. So Getaway Glamour is the one with the biggest difference between top and bottom players in terms of where they pick it. Second one is Ruthless Lawbringer. It's also a half pick difference between those. This is a 3-mana 3/2 in Orzhov. When it ETBs, you can sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent. So 2 removal spells already. Then we have Take the Fall, also roughly half a pick higher picked by the top players. That's the blue mana instant. Target creature gets -1/-0. If it gets -4/-0 until end of turn, instead if you control an outlaw. And you draw a card. And this is a great combat trick. It counters sort of throw from the saddle, at least partially. It draws you a card. It commits a crime. It's like a very good linchpin of this Dimir deck I was talking about. Like you want to have a bunch of Take the Falls because you want to commit crimes all the time, because maybe you have Intimidation Campaign, maybe you have the Bandit's Hall, which is sort of Intimidation Campaign too. It plays very well in this particular deck. That's why the top players are valuing it quite highly, because they want to put them in their, maybe, like someone mentioned, Sam Black style Grixis crime decks. And by Grixis, I mean not necessarily Grixis, but maybe Dimir, maybe Izzet, maybe Rakdos. Well, you probably wouldn't put it in a Rakdos deck, would you? Next card that we have that top players value very highly is Back for More. This is recursion and removal in 1. 6 mana to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. When you do, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. This is great in Golgari decks, but it's also good in sort of Abzan concoctions where you combine aggression of white-green with some recursion from black, and this card is great in those. It's very game-swinging kind of play, especially when you have things that play well with it, like the Spinewoods Armadillo, the 7/7 that you can cycle and get a land. Well, you can cycle it, get a land, you have it in the graveyard very easily, and you can get it back with Back for More. 7/7 with Ward will definitely kill something in a fight, potentially also block something, killing the other thing. So great swing in the game. You can do a 3/1 quite easily with that. Mirage Mesa is another card that top players value highly. This is like generically good fixing. A desert that can tap for mana of any color, but you only choose once which color it will produce. Patient Naturalist. This is another part of this graveyard recursion package, like Back for More. You play the Patient Naturalist, you mill 3 cards, you might get back a land, or it will produce a treasure. And those cards in the graveyard can be potential targets for things like Back for More, or for a card that we're going to see in a second. Metamorphing Blast is a card that also is probably undervalued by the bottom tier players. That's a spree card. And basically what it does is for 2 mana at instant speed, it turns something into an 0/1 rabbit. Or for 4 mana, you can draw 2 cards, or you can force your opponent to draw 2 cards. I don't know how often is that used. And for 5 mana, you get both. So you basically turn something into an 0/1 rabbit and you draw 2 cards. And this is great because it's a sort of removal. You turn something into an 0/1, it can get eaten in combat because it's an instant, so great. And sometimes you draw 2 cards, which is great if you're playing this crime deck that needs stuff that can commit crime, and you need to draw cards for that. Mourner's Surprise, another card, like roughly 0.4 picks, picked 0.4 picks higher by the top players. It's a very linchpin card for either green-black or green-white or green-blue. All of those decks do want their Mourner's Surprise. The more bombs you have in your deck, the better the card becomes. It's basically a 2-mana Gravedigger, but the Gravedigger is a 1/1 mercenary token with tap to boost power of something. And it returns a card from your graveyard to your hand. It's a great little card that allows you to grind through the opponents, because you have the removal, you commit the crimes, you trade some creatures, then you get back the creatures. Usually your creatures will have some ETB value or something, like perfect with the Honest Ratstein, where you can play Radstein, get something back to your hand, recast something else, chump with Radstein, or block trade with Radstein, get it back, trade the other thing, replay the Radstein, take back the other thing. And, it goes on. And you have so much card advantage that at some stage, opponent is going to be left with empty board because you traded everything, but you got all your stuff back. And because you got all your stuff back, you don't need like very potent threats. A 3-2 will be just fine to kill your opponent because they don't have anything on board. Another card that top players pick highly, and that's my mea culpa from last week when I was making fun of this card. Well, turns out Bucolic Ranch is actually pretty good. But one learns the hubris of myself mocking Bucolic Ranch, and 2 days later, I was like thinking about, God, I wish I had a ranch in this deck. Because sometimes when you play green-white or maybe like Gruul, it's just so good to have something to do with your mana, and you will hit once every 5 activations. It will make you draw a card, but even more importantly, it will stop you from drawing more lands if you're already flooded. Because if you see a land on top, you just put it on the bottom. If you get a mount from the top, you draw a card. It's great. And if you see something good, you just keep it, and you have that selection is going to at least give you a fighting chance in those games where you run out of fuel a bit and you're hoping for something. So yeah, pretty good. Also, because in green you will often play the Outcaster Green Blade, you can find your Bucolic Range quite easily with it. And if you played the Green Blade early, you probably want to get your fixing land. But if you play your Green Blade late, like normally I just pick Pylons because I usually have Pylons in my deck just for the Surveil trigger. But if I could pick Bucolic Ranch, I would be very happy to pick it at that particular stage and then start using it to fix my draws. And the last card we have on the list is the Stubborn Burrow Fiend. That's the 2-mana Badger Beast Mount, and it has graveyard synergies. But it's good in also white-green. It's the one that mails you, and then it gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Yeah, it's a great card. 2-mana mounts are very important if you're playing Miriam, because you want to play a 2-mana mount and then on turn 3 Miriam, hopefully with the Snakeskin Veil protection on. And if you do that, it's very hard to lose a game. And Stubborn Burrow Fiend is one of the cards that can enable that. The other one is Arynx, and maybe the third one is Mobile Homestead, the vehicle, because Miriam also boosts vehicles. Please do remember that. Now there are cards that are valued lowered by the top players, and I'm not going to spend so much attention to those. I'm going to show you all of them because if you think that any of those cards is like excellent, maybe you should slightly reevaluate it. And Rustler Rampage is probably not interesting, but it's whole 1-pick difference in terms of where do people pick it. So yeah, you definitely don't want to pick Rustler Rampage. Card just doesn't perform very well. Maybe there are some decks that want to use it, but I still didn't find one. Fleeting Reflection, the hexproof trick in blue, doesn't really do what blue wants to be doing. Rodeo Pyromancers, these are the cards that I would never want to be putting in my deck. Shifting Grift. This is the only one where I can make a sort of soapbox part of it. This is the classical card that the lower tier players will overvalue because it promises something incredible. You think, ooh, I'm going to trade this 1/1 mercenary that I have lying around, and I'm going to get their Bonipal or whatever, or 7/7 Armadillo or something. The problem with that is that, first of all, you need to be in the situation when you can do it. Then you need to have mana to do it. Then you need to make sure that there is like no interaction. And this card has been played against me once, and I had a Bounding Felidar, and opponent tried to swap it for their mercenary. And I had 1 black mana on open only, and I just cast Skullduggery on the mercenary. The exchange control cards in Magic work in such a way that if any of the creatures for the exchange disappears before the exchange happens, the exchange doesn't happen. So by killing their 1/1 mercenary in response to the Shifting Grift, once the mercenary was also already targeted, I stopped the card. I basically countered it for 1 mana, and yeah, it was not fun for the opponent, I'm pretty sure. But that's why you should probably avoid playing cards like that, because you are opening yourself to this kind of blowout. And sometimes it will work and it will give you a nice high of, yeah, I did it. But lots of the time it will be just like, oh, I don't have anything to trade, or oh, I don't have anything that I would like to trade for. And it's a problematic card, and yeah, I would advise you to limit playing it to the minimum. Single target mind controls are very good, yes, because you don't need to swap anything. You don't need to provide anything on board already. Also, giving them even the 1/1 is not nothing. It's the difference between like a card that kills something and a card that kills something and they get a 1/1 token. The one that says kill something and they get the 1/1 token is probably going to be pretty rubbish. And we've seen that time and time again. Even if you kill something good, the 1/1 is still something. Exactly. The 1/1 is still Lawbringer fodder. If you want to, sacrifice your 1/1 to kill something of theirs, the Lawbringer is a way better choice. And yeah, Bovine Intervention is a great example. Giving 2/2 just makes this card completely unplayable. Then we have Gem Lightfoot, the Azorius Signpost. It's also not very much prioritized by the top players because they don't want to be playing Azorius that much. And yeah, the card is not impressive. It also suffers, I think, that in this set in particular, flying creatures are paying a high price for just the sheer amount of playable reach creatures. And so often I've seen my opponent like playing the flyers and like, yeah, whatever, I have a 3/3 reach creature because there is like 7 of them or something. I'm exaggerating here, yeah, don't quote me on that, but there's plenty of them. So the flyers are slightly underpowered through the omnipresence of reach. And probably this is also why Djinn of the Fool's Fall is on that list, because it's just a dumb 4/3 flyer, and you can always block it with your 3/3 reach creature. And the rate on it is not that amazing. Deep Mug Desperado, I think that this is one of the cards that is probably single-handedly responsible for Dimir numbers being so weird, because it is the low win rate players that play it more than the top win rate players. The top win rate players don't find the dream of milling someone out as appealing, and when they do it as one should, with Archive Trap and recurring Archive Trap a couple of times from your graveyard. Fling, another card that appeals to the lower win rate players. Spring Splasher, the 2-drop in blue, the 2/1 that whenever it attacks, target creature defending controls gets -3/-0. Look, I've been killed by it. It did happen, but most of the time the card just doesn't do anything, because for it to be any good, it needs to be attacking, and blue is not really designed to be attacking in the early turn. It's designed to be blocking in the early turn, so it's completely against plan, and that's why the top players just ignore that card as much as they can. And same with Razzle Dazzler, the 2-mana 1/2 in blue, that whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's just requires you to jump through many hoops to get a 2/3. And the biggest problem with the card is not even that you're not capable of casting 2 spells on the same turn. It's that you're going to be compelled to do so. And by being compelled to do so, you sometimes will cast the spells on wrong spots for the spells to be cast. I'm pretty sure that some people will cast like the 1-mana cantrip just to burn it, or Razzle Dazzler, and then follow it up with the 1-mana cantrip just to burn it. And this is not the optimal use of that card. Then later someone will play throw from the saddle on Razzle Dazzler, and you're just missing this 1-mana card to give -4/-0 to that. Because you burned it to give the counter, and then you lose both the counter and you misplayed the card. And yeah, generally Razzle Dazzler is again not on the plan of what blue is the best of, and I think it also suffers from the fact that it's not an outlaw for some mysterious reason. You can look at the evaluation of the card from many different angles, and last slide I showed you was how highly they pick those cards when they see them. But you can also look at the pick preference. So what percentage of the time when they see a card do the players pick it? And this is a slightly different metric because it doesn't give the same cards basically. So let's look at the cards, and this is one of the weirdest results that I think I have an explanation for, but we're going to go through cards valued high by the top players, and this is the difference in pick rate between the medium players and the bottom players. Here we're going to spend some time on those graphs, so get used to that. So, for example, if the medium players, if the bottom players will pick Hostile Investigator 50% of the time, that's an example number, the medium tier players will pick it 64.8% of the time, because the difference between those is 14.8 percentage points. So yeah, Hostile Investigator has 15 percentage points difference between how high do medium players pick it and the bottom tier players pick it. And yeah, as someone said in the chat, why wouldn't you pick a 3-for-1? Because that's what Hostile Investigator is in the end. When ETB's target opponent discards a card, and when someone discards a card, you investigate. So you will draw a card somewhere in the future. And you still are left with the 4/3 body, which will be either killed by removal or by a trick, or will trade with something, which is great. So you naturally 3-for-1. That's why this card is so great. Also, it's from the big score. Keep that in mind. The second card that the medium players pick higher versus the bottom players is Bristlebutt Farmer. And that's a 4-mana 5/5 that enters with 2 food tokens. Whenever it attacks, I may sacrifice a food, and if I do, mill 3 cards and put one of them into your hand if it's a permanent. It's also a big score card. Okay, let's move on further. 30 percentage points difference. Nexus of Becoming, 6 mana. At the beginning of combat on your turn, draw a card. Then you may exile an artifact or creature card from your hand. If you do, create a token that is a copy of the exiled card, except the 3/3 artifact golem creature in addition to its other types. It's another big score card that is 13 percentage points underdrafted by the bottom tier players. Next, Collector's Cage. Another big score card. That's the hideaway artifact that puts counters on something, and once you have 3 different powers among your creatures you control, you can cast the hidden card without paying its mana cost. I got Bonnie Pold from that card, and it didn't feel very nice, and I didn't win that game. Another big score card. Then we have a Prismatic Vista from the Special Friends. That's basically fetch land for basics. A great way of splashing, a great way of fixing your mana. Should prioritize it. But the bottom tier players picking at 10 percentage points lower. Then we have a Primal Might from the special slot. That's the fight spell, but for green and X, it gives +X to the target creature until end of turn, and then it fights something. So you can make something very big, have it fight, and then bash face. Sandstorm Salvager, 3 mana for a 1/1, but it comes together with the 3/3 Golem Friend. And for 2 and a tap, it can actually grow every single creature token you control, putting +1/+1 counters on them and giving them trample until end of turn. So that's 9 percentage points lower picked than by the medium tier of the players. Pest Infestation, another card from the breaking news slot. That's a green XX. Destroy up to X target artifacts and or creatures and or enchantments, and you create twice X 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens with when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. It's great. You don't need to target an artifact. Please don't target a treasure, because opponent can sacrifice a treasure and fizzle your Pest Infestation. Just, for 5 mana you cast it, you have 4 1/1 pests. For 7 mana you cast it, you have 6 1/1 pests. Just like that, you get amazing value from it. Yeah, don't target the treasure unless you have another target that cannot be sacrificed. You can destroy, I don't know, Oblivion Ring or something. But yeah, the card is great, and it's still undervalued by the bottom tier players. But what I think happens here is that bottom tier players don't notice the big score slot. There's just too many of the big score cards on that list to be completely accidental. In fact, all the cards that we talked about so far are either from the special guest slot, or from the big score slot, or from the breaking news slot. None of those cards are from the main set. So I don't know what's going on in there. Maybe they just have this natural instinct of looking at the top left corner and picking the rare. Is that a possibility? Is the lack of knowledge of the cards, as the Conti said? So yeah, I think that there is something with information deficiency of a group of players, because if they would read the Bristlebutt Farmer, this card is a no-brainer that it's going to wreck games continuously. Just 4 mana for a 5/5 trample is enough. And then you get 2 food tokens. So even if it dies, it left something behind. And if it survives and manages to attack even once, you draw a card with some selection most of the time. So yeah. Cage is also great. Hostile Investigator, best black card in the set. So I don't think that they just know that those cards are there, and maybe they just have this heuristic, oh, I'll take the rare and I'll pass the Hostile Investigator. And they don't see that it's also a rare. So yeah. I know it's the Conti. I know that people who invested time to get 17 lands probably would invest time in reading cards. But maybe they just rushed through the drafts. And I don't have any other good explanation. But maybe that's enough of the discussion on those specific. We have 2 uncommons from the main sets. Outcaster Greenblade, the 3 mana 1/2 that fetches you a land. And it gets +1/+1 for each desert you control. It fetches you a basic or a desert. So most of the time it will be a desert. That card is great. I wrote a Twitter thread this week that compares it to Nazgul, because I think that this card is basically a Nazgul. It enters, it draws you a card, and by doing so, usually it grows itself. And then if you have a second copy, they help each other grow as well. So it is a Nazgul, basically. And then another card that is being passed by those bottom players is Lassoed by the Law, the 4 mana Oblivion Ring that makes a mercenary when it ETBs. Yeah, this kind of card is always good. And don't get me wrong, the bottom players do pick it, just not highly enough. It's just that they could ramp it up a bit, but medium players already know that Lassoed by the Law is a good card, and they pick it appropriately higher. When we compare top versus medium, because here we see like a difference in mentality between those two groups. Like medium players already know that the Lassoed by the Law is good. They do read the cards in the corner and outside of the corner. They do know that Bristlebutt Farmer, Hostile Investigator are in the pack, and you should be very careful. You shouldn't just get excited about the first bomb that you see, because those play packs have more than one bomb. But there are still some cards that they don't value highly enough. First one on the list is Overwhelming Forces. And there's a good reason why they might not value it correctly. Because in a recent year or two, the idea that an 8 mana card can be great in the format might have been somewhat controversial. And there's been a lot of content in the recent sets to say, oh, look, this is 8 mana that's unplayable. But in this format, you get to 8 mana no problem. And this card is, literally 8 mana, win the game. Kill all the creatures the opponent controls, draw a card for every creature destroyed this way. Like, you really have to almost mill yourself to death in order not to be able to cast this this spell. And it has 67% win rate, game in hand, which means that you will be able to cast this card in most of the games, especially because when you draft it, you probably want to design the deck in such a way that you want to survive to this 8 mana and you want to win with this card. But medium players still didn't get the memo, and they are picking it slightly lower by 12 percentage points lower, so not even slightly, quite a lot lower than the top players. Second card we see is Outcaster Greenblade. And this tells me one thing. that Outcaster Greenblade is our first of the cards that we have here that is an indicator of your skill level. How highly you prioritize Outcaster Greenblade is probably a good sort of like indicator of what is your skill level in the game. The better you are, the higher you prioritize the Greenblade. So, well, Poisanako, if you love that card, probably you're in a good spot. When I see it, it really has to be something for me to pick over a Greenblade. Yesterday, I opened the pack and I had the Rattleworm, the 4-mana 6/5 trample, and Greenblade. And I picked the Rattleworm, but I did spend some time thinking about which should I do. I think in the end, I think the Rattleworm was the right decision, but I was not 100% convinced if I shouldn't be picking just the Greenblade. Okay, next card that we have is Hollow Marauder. And this probably has this sort of similar problem as Overwhelming Forces. You look at it and you say, well, it's 7 mana, but in fact, that card is almost never 7 mana. It's going to be 4 mana. It's going to be 3 mana. I cast it so many times for 1 mana. And then you have a 4/2 flyer, and no, 4/2 flyer is usually a stat line that I don't like that much. But 3/2 for 4 mana is also not the stat line I love a lot. But in Midnight Hunt, I would play Organ Hoarder as much as I possibly physically can, because if that 3/2 body comes with a Brainstorm attached to it, or whatever, strategical, what is it? Strategical something. Look at top 3 cards, draw 1, put 2 in the graveyard. I'm fine with the 3/2 body. I don't like the Moroi from last set, the 4/2 flyer, but I do like Hollow Marauder that enters the battlefield, makes them discard something. Strategic planning, thank you. Makes them discard something, and if they don't discard something really expensive, I also draw a card, which is great. The worst case scenario I've seen with this card is when Corticals was playing it, and the opponent discarded the Madness removal from the breaking news sheet and killed the Hollow Marauder with the Madness cost. That was the worst possible. They only lost 1 card through that, and they killed your Marauder. So, yeah. In any other scenario, you are definitely favored to get at least a 2/1, if not a 3/1. But medium players still didn't completely get the idea just how busted this card is. They pick it, just not highly enough. Crackle with Power, another card that maybe people think, oh, well, that's a bit too expensive. This is sort of like Doppelgang level. When you pay 8 mana and you basically win the game. You get to 11 mana, you definitely win the game. I probably should move to the actual picture of the card. Crackle is like a good top-end plan. And, you still have the emergency option of casting it for 5 mana, just killing something. Fine. Buried in the Garden. This is a very important card in this set. And top player know that, first of all, removal is important. Second of all, they do like splashing more than other groups of players. And, Buried is one of the premier removal spells, and also in the really good color. So picking it highly, picking it whenever you see it is a very good strategy. And the medium level players still didn't get the full memo. Hostile Investigator, that's our second card that appeared on both lists. You can see that here we don't see that many big score cards. The medium player know what they're doing. They do read the cards. Still Hostile Investigator, they are high on it, but just not as high as the top players. And again, this is probably an indicator card that will put you in the right tier if you think how you evaluate this card. If you looked at this card and said, well, that's fine, probably you got some work to do on card evaluation still. Stubborn Burrowfiend, third card on the list that was on the difference between medium and bottom, but there's also a difference between top and medium. And this means that, this card like stably progresses. I'm pretty sure that, you reach a certain moment when you cannot evaluate it higher than it is evaluated. But there is still a big difference between top and medium player, like 8 percentage points. Burrowfiend is the most busted 2-drop of the set. It's among those, yes, it's among those. I'm pretty sure that Dusk Animus is the most busted 2-drop in the set, but it's not a 2-drop really, is it? Yeah, Burrowfiend the Naturalist is ouch. I've seen it happen today already. It didn't win the game in the end, but only because Alex was playing one removal deck. Pest Infestation, 4th indicator card on that list. It was the difference between bottom and medium. It is the difference between medium and top. So no matter how how highly you look at Pest Infestation should be a good sort of indicator for your skill level. You should be evaluating it at around an A. Then we have Spinewood's Armadillo. This again looks like a dumb beast, but it's far from being a dumb beast. The word 3 on that card means that it doesn't have the problem that traditional dumb beasts have, where you spend 6 mana, you cast your dumb beast, and then they spend 3 mana and kill it. Well, now they have to spend 6 mana to kill it, and that's a fine exchange then. Yeah, they killed your stuff, but they spent as much mana as you spent casting it. Fine. But it has many other uses. We talked about how you can get back for more with it. And we have our 5th indicator card, Lassoed by the Law. It was the difference between bottom and medium. It is the difference between top and medium, which means that how highly you evaluate the card is going to be also a good indicator of your which tier you should be positioning yourself into. And yeah, you don't have to be wrong on every single one of those indicator cards. Maybe, if you get like 4 of them right and 1 wrong, maybe you're like the upper medium tier. If you get 3 right and 2 wrong, maybe you're like middle medium tier and stuff, and goes on and on and on. And here the difference between top and bottom, like the most extreme cards of the set. And you can see that 3 of our indicator cards are in the top. Hostile Investigator, 23 percentage points difference between how highly top players and the bottom players pick this card. That's a lot. That means that if top players pick it like 70% of the time when they see it, bottom players will pick it like they do pass it. I mean, it will happen because you're in pack 3. You see the Investigator and you are in like streamlined green white mounts deck. Probably you're not picking it because you don't have the fixing prepared for it. Or you open it in the pack with I don't know, Bonnie Pal, and you pick Bonnie Pal over it. That's excusable. So you will pass it sometimes. That's fine. But definitely the top players pick it up at higher frequency. And I thought it was around 76% for the top tier, which means it picked roughly 50% for the of the time for the bottom tier. And then we have Outcaster Greenblade, Pest Infestation, Collector's Cage. We talked about all of those cards. Hollow Marauder, Nexus of Becoming, Stubborn Burrowfiend, Lassoed by the Law, Sandstorm Salvager, and Primal Might. You can see that this is a neat mixture of rares, but not from the main set, and some uncommons from the main set, which is a bit of a strange thing. This is something that confirms my hypothesis that bottom tier players don't read the pack rigidly or rigorously enough, because you don't see any rares from the main set in this list, which is a bit weird. Like, why you wouldn't see the rares from the main set, and you do see the so many of those rares and mythics from the supplemental slots? Okay, what do we have more? Now here we have the cards that are picked higher by the lower tier players. Between medium and bottom, I'm again not going to discuss those cards in such detail as I did for the top cards, because I think it's more important for you to understand what the top cards are. But here, I think that some of those cards are a bit traps in the way that they're not as good as they seem to be on the first look. And Geralt the Fleshwright is the biggest delta card from those. 13 percentage points difference between medium and bottom tier. Card is good. It's just not great. It feels beatable. and I had it being activated a couple of times, and still Flesh Right. Family show. So yeah, big difference. Second card is Slickshot Show Off. 2 mana, 1/2 flying haste. When you cast a non-creature spell, Slickshot Show Off gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This card, its problem is that it's a constructed card. It's not supported in limited. It will be very rare that it's going to be great. And I think bottom tier players just see that something is good in constructed and think, if it's good in constructed, it's going to be good in limited as well. That's not the case with some cards. Some cards are just atrocious in limited, even though they are constructed staples. That's not to say that always be the case. There are some good limited cards that also happen to be good constructed cards, but Slickshot Show Off, no, because it's a super synergistic card. It requires a deck to be built around it, and then it's going to be amazing, I'm sure. But yeah, it has pretty bad win rate in. Hello, dog. What are you doing here? My dog stormed in through the door, not caring, just opened it and came in. Magda the Horde Master is another card that is picked super highly. And I think that this card would have been amazing in some of the recent sets. It's just not that great in here because red is not as aggressive as it would like to be. So you don't need that 2-drop 2/2. It's also not an outlaw. So it just doesn't completely fit. And I think that part of it is the top players will be avoiding red slightly. And we will see that in the selection of the cards that are picked lower by them. Even though some of those cards are actually good on this list. Akul the Unrepentant, that's basically a hard to cast 5/5 flying trample. You can do better in this set. So you don't need to prioritize it. And already medium player understand that, and they don't pick it as... not as aggressive. I mean, not as good, because I think that red is best when it is aggressive. So Hell to Pay, that's just a bad removal spell, but it's a rare, and I think that fools some bottom tier players. They say, well, it's a rare card, it certainly must be good. No, it doesn't need to be good. This one is actually quite medium. I can imagine you can send me the screenshots when you've done something amazing with it, and I believe you. But most of the time, it's just going to be very inefficient removal. Even in a format where removal is important, this is too inefficient. Collective Defiance is similar. It's an okay removal, a bit hard to cast because you have to be heavy red. But yeah, I mean, is it better than the common removal spell you have in the set? I don't think so. And you have to pick it really highly to have it in your deck. And I think that that's why higher win rate players just decide that it's not worth the hassle. Killing the Kid, it's in the colors that probably, are hard to play together. The band colors don't naturally synergize, I think, in this set, for me at least. Although I can imagine something around plotting, but there's not so much plotting in white, I guess. So this is a card I will opportunistically pick when I don't know, when I see it late. But will I see it late? No, because it's a mythic, and arena economy is not conducive to passing mythics too far. Stingerback Terror. Now this card is good, but I think that the bottom tier players will do think more frequently than not that this card is absolutely busted, and it's not. It's a solid card. It will have its spots. I've been beaten by it in the pre-release, which could be anyone, because I don't know. I think that in a pre-release of 12 people, there were 7 copies of it opened. So I have a large experience of playing against this card. But it's not the same level as some of the other bombs that we'll be looking at later, maybe. Jace Reawakened, that's also like, oh, it's a Jace, it's a Planeswalker, and I think that sort of ramps how high do players want to pick it. They're looking at the collection of those cards. There might be some rare drafting ramifications involved here. And Lila, Undefeated Slickshot, another very situational rare. I can imagine playing it in a deck, but it would have to be very specific deck. I want to have like 2 Hypothesizels and 2 Slick Sequences in order to play that card. Otherwise, it's just like slightly unimpressive in the 3/3 with prowess. So yeah. Interesting point is, what cards do the medium players overvalue compared to the top players? And number 1 on the list is the Sword of Wealth and Power. And I think that top players, for some time already, they notice that the swords, even in limited, they're unplayable in constructed already. But even in limited, they are not that great, because the cost that you need to sink to equip it for the first time is a bit too much. I mean, I was there when Sword of Ice and Fire was Fire and Ice was first printed, and yeah, that card was like, what? How can a card do that? Well, and now it's not as impressive. I think we move far away from this kind of, well, maybe I'll get a value from it at one stage cards. Yeah, maybe in Commander they are more playable. Here we have our first indicator card, and it's Jace. The top players are much lower on Jace than the medium tier players, which makes it a favorite to be the card with the highest delta between top and the bottom players as well. So this is clearly an indicator card, because both between bottom and medium tier and between top and medium tier, we see the big difference in prioritization of this card. So the lower you are on Jace, the good sign would be the better player you are. Vraska, that's another probably victim of it being legendary and well-known character in the game. The card is not that great. So it's a 3/3 with Death Touch, really. And sometimes you will get some kind of a small bonus from that. And that's doesn't warrant probably picking it, pick 1, pick 2, pick 3 or something. You'd want to reserve that for really solid cards with high win rate. Tiny Bones, same situation. The card is not bad, but in limited it will be just chump, and it will never accrue the value. Just won't happen. Kervek the Punisher. This again, casting it on Curve is a big risk of that doing nothing in the game, because it will just die and then you don't get any value. Eating and removal is fine. And then maybe later in the game it can become pretty decent. But the problem with it is you have to lose life, and your decks that commit crimes don't want to lose life. They want to gain life, because probably they are on a low life total at some stage, because they are not exactly fastest of the starting blocks. So that's a problem. And you need to pay the mana for the card, which is non-trivial if you need to cast something to commit a crime most of the time, and still have mana up to be able to cast the spell that you select. And you need to have something in the graveyard in the first place. So you have to jump through many hoops for it to become good. And I think that top players evaluate correctly that it might be a lot of hoops to jump, and maybe too many. And the win rate is also not that impressive. Slickshot Show Off is our second indicator card in this category. So the higher you are on Slickshot Show Off, the better indication that you have some work to do to get to the around 60% win rate. Don't tell it to my mate, who is of course loves the card. Then we have Los Jite, another card that might suffer from a bit historical nostalgia. It's not as good as the original Jite, not even close. Akul the Unrepentant, another of our indicator cards. Again, it's just a French vanilla 5/5 for relatively cheap. But that's not that great, given how hard it is to cast, and that you have to be in Rakdos colors to be able to cast it all together. Archangel of Tides, another card that suffers from the difficulty of casting it. There's not so many decks that I will be playing in this format that are that heavily in white for the Archangel to be dropped on turn 4. And also, this is a removal format. It doesn't have any kind of ETB effect, so if it dies instantly, it did nothing. And that's a tough ask to play a creature with that kind of cost and have it die instantly. And Terror of the Peaks, which might be surprising, but That doesn't mean that the top players don't pick it. It's just that they don't go out of their way to play the Terror of the Peaks, especially in Pack 3. And Giggling Warlock says they will be playing Terror of the Peaks because dragons are cool, good or not. I'm not saying it's not good. I'm just saying that the top players are not as high on it as the medium players. They don't go like, oh, I have to pick Terror of the Peak. They know that you can pass it and it's fine. It's still like, 60%, 70% of the time they will pick it. It's just that it's not going to be 80. That's the difference between those two. But also, it's very it's a healthy thing that you're going to pick dragons because you think they're cool, independent of the quality. It's a healthy thing. I think that I'm talking about optimizing win rate. I rarely talk about should you be optimizing win rate at all costs. And no, you shouldn't. I throw drafts all the time because I want to do something fun, and it's fine if you can afford it. Okay, here we have the last one, the top versus the bottom, and we see the indicator cards. So the Slickshot Show Off, Jace Reawakened. We see Vraska again, Sword of Wealth and Power, Geralf, Akul the Unrepentant, Hell to Pay, Tiny Bones, Magda, and Kalandikid. All those cards were there before. Of course, if you compound two groups of players on top of each other, you will get similar cards. But yeah, we have the couple of those cards being indicators, and especially Slickshot, Show Off, and Jace are the cards that, if you are high on them, probably you are not in the top tier. This shows the player's preference, but it's not only preferences that count, it's also the results. So here we're going to look at the same kind of graphs, but with the cards that have a higher win rate between different tiers. Now, of course, top tier will generally have a higher win rate than the bottom tier. That's just how it is. So every card in top tier probably will have a higher win rate in the hands of the top tier players than the bottom tier players. But of course, some of those cards will be roughly at the average difference of win rate between those tiers, and some cards will be much higher. And I'm going to focus on those cards. So like which cards have the biggest difference in win rate between two groups, and which cards have the smallest difference between two groups. And from those cards, we can also get some general ideas. Like, for example, which cards are more difficult to play? You would assume that top players are playing slightly better Magic. That's how life unfortunately operates. So the cards that have a biggest delta between top and bottom tier are going to be the cards that are probably the hardest to play. And if you're playing those cards frequently and you're losing and you don't understand because you see people winning with those cards all the time, well, this is probably where some of your gameplay leaks are. I'm not going to tell you how to fix them, but it's good to be able to diagnose them. Okay, so the biggest card between middle and bottom, the biggest delta of any win rate is Brimstone Roundup. Don't get me wrong, this card doesn't have an impressive win rate in the hands of the middle tier players, but it has an atrocious win rate in the hands of the bottom tier players. Since this is still a new set and this is not like exactly the staple card for the draft, Brimstone Roundup is a 1 and a red enchantment. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token, and it has plot for 2 and a red. So you can plot it at some later turn. You cast it for 0, you cast another spell, trigger Brimstone Roundup, and you get the mercenary. This card is like sub-average win rate for both the middle and the top tier, but it has a really, really bad win rate in the hands of the bottom tier players, which means this is a particularly difficult card to play for beginners. Keep that in mind if you are one. Okay. Brewstyle, Roving Rancher. 2 red and a white for a human warrior 4/3 legendary creature. Oxen you control have double strike. Whenever Brewstyle Roving Rancher enters the battlefield or attacks, exile the top card of your library. If it's a land card, create a 2/2 white Ox creature token. Otherwise, you may cast it until the end of your next turn. Now, I don't know why. Bottom tier players have a really low win rate with Brewstyle. The card is generally good. Middle tier players have something like 62% win rate with that, which is great. That's a bomb level. Top players even higher, but bottom tier players only break like 50% win rate with this card, and I find it a bit mind-boggling, and I don't understand why. It might be due to the fact that they just draft the Boros decks badly, and not even Bruce Starr can save them from losing the games because the rest of the deck is not up to standard. Dilex is suggesting that they should have made more cascade spells. Please no. Equalizer has a good hypothesis that lower tier players play it in red-white decks, while mid-tier players splash Bruce Starl in their green-white or green-red decks. Very likely, very likely. I had it once, and obviously it was a splash. And maybe they play too many high drops, and the exile clause of Bruce Starl, if you hit a 7-drop out of it, is not going to be good. That's another valid hypothesis. I guess we'll never know. But there is an 11.7 percentage point difference in win rate between middle and bottom tier, and the average difference between those two groups is going to be closer to 6 percentage points, so almost double of the average. Crown Violent Cacophony is another one. That's the Signpost Legend. 4 mana for a 2/3 flyer, and when you cast your second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Crown and draw a card. Now, yeah, obviously you need to plan to play this card in such a way that you double spell. So probably it's more like a turn 6 play. When on turn 6 you cast Crown, then you instantly cast a second spell, you draw your card, you put a counter. Even if opponent kills it, you basically are at least 0 on mana. And I don't know, maybe too many, maybe the bottom tier players play it on turn 4 too often. Maybe they play it on turn 4 not frequently enough. It all depends from context. I don't know. There clearly are some leaks in their gameplay, and if you cannot win with Crown, you probably should. If you think that the card is doing terribly with you, you probably should evaluate some kind of play choices that you're making, or probably forecasting it. That's another option. Yeah. It is hard to build in this set. It is hard to build, but as I showed, top players figured out Izzet to some extent over the first week, because the win rate for the archetype has increased by quite a lot. Another card that has a big difference between middle and bottom is Calamity, Galloping Inferno. Probably difference in deck building, probably some differences in gameplay. There's so many factors that can contribute to it, but the reality is bottom tier, win rate tier players are not winning a lot with Calamity. And that probably is the reason why the whole win rate of the card is way below what I was expecting before the set hit. I guess it does require some careful decision making and careful planning of how you sequence your turn to get the maximum value out of it. Mobile Homestead, that's a card that is not straightforward to play, but it's a good one. So yeah, again, if you think that this card is rubbish, it's not. So maybe you should rethink about how you play this card and what this is good at. Keep in mind that there is one vehicle synergy in the set, namely Miriam. So Mobile Homestead can actually work as a sort of trained Arynx when you can play it on turn 2, turn 3 Miriam, crew it with her swing, and it becomes a 4/4 and maybe even ramps you. So yeah, it's good in this kind of a deck. Wrangler of the Damned, not a great card, but doing even worse in the hands of the bottom tier players, probably because they don't play Azorius very well. Rakish True, that's another card with the high delta, like 10 percentage points difference in win rate between middle and bottom. That's the 3 mana enchantment that makes a 1/1 mercenary, and whenever an outlaw you control dies, you drain for 1. Fake Your Own Death. This is the example of the card that I've been telling you that the top player will get much better. Because when do you leave mana open for it? When do you cast it? Do you save this creature, or do you wait for doing something else? Do you cycle it at the end of the turn just to get a treasure sometimes? Lots of small choices you can make with the card, and cards like that make lots of the small choices are very frequently going to benefit more advanced players and not the bottom tier. Rattleback Apothecary. This again, do I give lifelink? Do I give menace to my creature? How do I maximize it? Do I attack with this and have it being chomped by a 2/2? Lots of small decisions with the card. Also, I think that it has a higher win rate in the middle tier because it's played in Boros more frequently, I guess. So yeah, couple of small things. I didn't mean Boros, I meant Orzhov. And the last card on the list is Forlorn Flats, and that's the only land on that list. That's the Black-White Desert. I think that this reflects the difference in the win rate in Orzhov is disproportionate. That Orzhov is not absolutely trivial to build. It's a very good deck, but you need to know how to build it, and I think that maybe the bottom tier players are still struggling with it. Differences cards that are different in the win rate between top and the middle. Fortune, Loyal Steed, another excellent example of a card with multiple functionalities. Because, yeah, you enter, you scry. That's already choices that you need to make. Do I move to the bottom? Scrying is a very skill testing ability. But then it only becomes worse from there, because whenever you saddle an attack, you need to make sure that, will I get the trigger? Will I want to blink my creature? What do I do with it? And then you have another scry if you did it. So yeah, lots of choices, and then top players seem to come out of those choices better. Full Steam Ahead is the overrun for the set. Gives +2/+2 and trample, and this creature can't be blocked by more than one creature until end of turn. I'm guessing that the top players are much better in causing board stalls. And if you want to play this card, causing a board stall is a great idea, because if you attack with Full Steam Ahead and there's a board stall, opponent will have to do some really, really unfavorable blocks. But if you don't respect your board and you don't end up with like 4 or 5 creatures on it, the card is not very useful. So probably this is the reason why there's a difference between top and middle that is so large. Binding Negotiation, another card that requires choices. That's the Thoughtseize for 2 mana, but you don't pay 2 life, and you can discard a plotted card. Here it might be 2 things. First of all, you need to make choices when you do Thoughtseize. It's another skill challenging card. But also I think that there might be a tendency of players to keep it in their hand until someone plots something to get rid of it, so that they waste their mana. And it's not always the best strategy. Sometimes you just cast it on 2 if you don't have anything else to do. Interesting card on this list is Sandstorm Verge. That's the desert that for 3 colors and the tap, target creature can't block this turn, activate only as sorcery. I've been playing against this card. It was mildly annoying. And coming on a land in a deck that can put it easily, because it's a 2-color deck, it doesn't need any mana intensity, especially when you have a couple of ways of searching it out. It sounds like a good idea. I think that Deep Cavern Bat was in this category. Yeah. Brimstone Roundup, our first sort of gameplay indicator card. It was the biggest difference between the top tier, middle tier, and the bottom tier. But it's also one of the biggest deltas between top tier and middle tier. So this card is sort of linearly increasing as you get a higher win rate in terms of how well you can utilize it. And yeah, it's way above what you would be expecting. And then we have a couple of like minor cards like Outlaw's Fury, the Trumpet Blast of the set. It has some additional skill decision making, because you need to make sure that you cast it in a way that exiling the card from the top of your library is going to be wasting a card. Soured Springs, that's a picture probably of top players being really good at Dimir, while no other group of players is good in Dimir. Again, look into my article. There are some tips on how to draft Dimir. Ruthless Lawbringer. Did we have it before? Not in this particular one. But yeah, another card that is probably linked to deck building and playing Orzhov much better by the top players. Gold Rush. Top players know much better how to use this card as a sort of ramp/fixing spell. And if you haven't been here at the beginning, I was showing them my deck list, and I did have my Gold Rushes there because it was so useful to generate that treasure and ramp. And if not ramp, then fix colors for those 5-color concoctions. It's pretty useful, and I think top players are pretty good in figuring it out. And Caustic Bronco, I don't know exactly what is the reason here. Card is clearly good, but it might be that top players know better how to build their mana curve in order not to kill yourself with Caustic Bronco and be able to use it. Like, you don't want to play Caustic Bronco in a deck with like 3/7 drops. unless you only plan to attack with it while it's saddled, and that's another thing. Maybe bottom tier players are not that, or lower tier players are not that great in planning when to attack with the saddle and not. So difference between all the groups, we have Brimstone Roundup, Sandstone Verge. These are the biggest differences, like 19 percentage points between top players and bottom players. Mobile Homestead, Crown, Violent Cacophony, Ruthless Lawbringer. We've seen all of those. One card that joins the list that was not there before is Lazav. And again, Demir is played pretty badly by the bottom tier players. They have a very low win rate, while the win rate for top players is quite high. So probably there is some deck building issue there. Fortune, we mentioned Slickshot Voltbuster. Not only it is valued highly by the lower win rate players, but also those low win rate players lose even more when they have Slickshot show off in their deck, because it's not even that impressive in the hands of top players. So yeah, go figure. Intimidation Campaign is a card that shows skill disproportions. It's a very tricky card to play because you need to plan, how am I going to trigger my crimes? How do I fit it on the mana curve and stuff like that? So, and Canyon Crab is the last one that has a difference in the win rate. This is another hard card to play because you need to make a choice whether I'm casting a spell or not casting a spell. And then you draw, choose what to discard. You also have a choice of making it bigger, smaller. It's a lot of decisions that you make around the card, and that will promote the top players versus the bottom players. Also, it's in the archetypes that top players are going to be having disproportionately higher win rate in. And now, last part, not least, well, actually it is least, cards with the lowest win rate difference between different groups. And these are the cards that sort of, if you are in those lower tiers, or you think you might be in those lower tiers of win rate, these are the cards you should be paying attention to and figuring out, because these are the cards where you are going to maybe find potential edges for yourselves, or maybe find spots where you know that you're not doing things in a perfect way. So, for example, Wily Duke, a teen hero, is the card that has actually the bottom tier players have a higher win rate with it than the middle tier players, which is a bit strange. Also, there's not a big difference in this card between bottom and top tier players, which means that this card does what it says on the tin. It's relatively straightforward. You tap it, you draw a card, and it's a good decision. If you were in the bottom tier, you know that Wily Duke is the card that you're going to play fantastically with. So you should probably play it a lot. Make your own luck. Turns out it's just fine. You pay 5, you look at the 3 cards, you probably pick the most expensive ones and cast it for free, or plot it for free, and the other 2 you draw. So despite having a selection, this card is not complicated. It's a great way of maybe starting to play with selection, because it's easier than with some other cards, because here you're already prompted naturally to pick the most expensive card because you don't have to pay for it. While if you are casting Impulse, you need to plan your mana around it. There's like some extra levels of complications. Hellspur Brood. The card literally says what it says, what you need to be doing, and you need to be playing a lot of outlaws and making it cheaper. And it turns out that you can't squeeze out much more of a win rate using that card. That's why the difference between middle and bottom is just like 1.5%. Overzealous Muscle. Now, this card, not doing very well for middle players because, well, again, it does what it says on the tin. It's like a 5/4. But for lower win rate players, just having a big beater is probably fine. So if they want to develop, they definitely need to wean off creatures like Overzealous Muscle because they are not so great. But it does work because it will work in the lower ranks as well. much better than it does in the higher ranks. Like if you play Overzealous Muscle in Mythic, you're probably going to lose because that card is just going to be turned into a buffoon by your opponent. Demonic Rachas is a decent card and slightly wrong color for the set. No big difference in the win rate. Cheshire Creeper. How do I know if I am in the lower ranks? No, lower ranks does not link to the tiers on Arena. If you have a 17 lands account, then if your win rate is around 50%, probably you're in those lower ranks. If it's around 55, you'll be in the middle ranks probably. And if you were around 60%, you'll be in the top tier. That's how you know if you have a 17 lens account and you track your data. If you don't track your data, well, part of it would be to figure out by thinking about the cards I'm talking about and thinking what is your position on those cards. That's why we're talking about them, because we want to help you to find cards that will be good indicators of where you are in this thing. So that, especially the previous part when I talked about how people prioritize the cards in draft and prioritize in putting them into their deck. What other cards do we have here? Heartless Pillage, not a big difference, but mainly because it's just not a great card and you can't get too much win rate out of it. Binding Negotiation, again, this card, middle players don't play that card very well, I think. And that's the sort of like way of seeing if you're in the middle tier. If that card doesn't work for you, then probably you are. Then we have a Gold Rush, the sort of splashing / combat trick card. This doesn't work very well for the middle tier players. I think that the top tier players are using this card much better than the bottom tier. Sheriff of the Safe Passage, that's a different story. This card is not doing great in general for the top levels because it's not on the plan with what you want to be doing in your white decks when you're playing at a slightly higher level. But it's a perfectly acceptable beater if you're playing like a simpler aggro strategy. The problem with the simpler aggro strategy, not based on mounts, is that it will not win more than 55% of the games. It will be difficult to achieve it. So you will be able to win some games, but you will never maximize your win rate if you're going for those kind of strategies. And Silver Deputy is just a terribly awful card. Just don't play it. It's there because there is a small difference between middle and bottom, because it's, even if you're a middle tier player, if you play Silver Deputy, you're going to lose a lot of games. It has a very low win rate. The cards that are the smallest difference between top and the middle, and here we have another, Slickshot Show Off has actually higher win rate in the middle tier than in top tier. Hellspur Posse Boss, again, higher win rate in middle tier than in top tier. And I think that these two specifically show that top tier players, they want to do more fancy stuff. And sometimes doing more fancy stuff just makes you forget the fundamentals of aggro decks. And the middle tiers players understand, they play maybe a simpler game, but it's more effective when you're playing aggro to play the simpler game and not to try to make things too cute and not to add a third splash in your aggressive deck, and it works for them. Then we have a bunch of bad cards in Inventive Wingsmith and Wanted Griffin. Form a Posse, I think that the same story as the Show Off and Posse Boss. They're just better in playing aggro because they don't try to make it too cute. Roxanne is there because the card is just so good that it transcends the tiers. It will carry the games on its own for those top players and middle players to have almost the same win rate. Getaway Glamour, I don't know why the difference is there. Maybe it's just a little bit of a variance, but yeah, the card is decent and it has a good win rate. Seraphic Steed, I think the same situation as with Roxanne. The card just carries the decks that it is in without too much problem. Those decks are also quite obvious, which means that the middle players can be at the same level as top players while playing those kind of cards. And Bruce Tarl is another example. Middle tiers do pretty well with it. But remember, bottom tier players do pretty bad with Bruce Tarl. So that's like a good indicator. Like if Bruce Tarl doesn't work for you, and probably means you're playing too much of the red-white version of the deck rather than splashing it in other colors, and that's why you're not winning as much. And we have Daring Thunder Thief, which just don't play it a card. That's the simplest advice I can give you. And the difference between top and bottom, that is the lowest. Cards of importance: Wily Duke, Atin Hero. This card performs really, really well in hands of those bottom win rate players, because maybe it shows that white-green is relatively straightforward to play. Trick Shot does the same, but it's because it's bad for the top players. Bounding Felidar, another card that is performing well for all the groups of players. It's because it's so hard to kill this thing. It will usually do its damage and has a decent win rate actually for the 6-drop. Heartless Pillage is just bad in the top players, but maybe works in the lower ranks that the bottom players will disproportionately occupy. Seraphic Stid, another bomb that just basically so good that any kind of tier of players is going to do fine with it. Silver Deputy is garbage. Raku's Entertainer. This card does pretty bad for top players, and I think mainly because they tried it early in the format and they tried to do cute things with it. I know because I tried myself. And because of that, it has a low win rate. It's a card that I don't want to have in my deck most of the time, and sometimes it will be great. Form a Posse, another testament to the fact that if you want to play aggro, keep it simple, probably, and because of that, you don't need to splash it in the deck or something. And 2 bad cards in Overzealous Muscle and Djinn of the Fool's Fall. Don't put too much attention to those in this data. They do better because probably simpler decks just do better when they have one big beater, but you cannot get any extra value from this card. I think bombs like Steel do better at lower win rates because the opponent will be less likely to have the removal necessary to deal with it. It also is possible that they will be uncontended more frequently. It always matters how you play with the card, Mr. Larlar. But, some cards are just more forgiving to any mistakes to be made. Seraphic Steed, in the end, does require some kind of thinking while playing around it, playing with it. Do I attack into something to get the angel? Do I wait for a combat trick to enable the attack scot-free? Like all those cards all those facts will somewhat impact how it's going. But yeah, I mean, it will carry just on pure sheer power. Djinn of Fool's Fall, that's the last one. And that's it. I went through many cards and 150 slides somehow because I did a separate slide for every picture. But we got there. So with that, I would like to thank the 17 Lands team, Viral Misnomer, Ale Baldini, who I hope is enjoying his holiday right now and not watching me. I would like to thank Fake Jake Brown, my secret helper. So secret, I put him literally on the slide. He helps me put the stuff on podcast, tells me where I have been dumb as a content creator and helps me to, become a better content creator. Tells me about weird things like advertisement rules of YouTube or something. He's an amazing person, and I'm very grateful that he is there to help me. And thanks to my patrons, including the free patrons who just joined to get notifications. Please do. Thanks to the people in Discord that motivate me. And if you don't know, you can join my Discord. There should be a link somewhere in my description. And thanks to MTJ Zone people for sponsoring, and thanks to Bulkbox for letting me push their product. And with that, I'll see you next week.